Welcome to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with host Lane Nordland.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Cattleman's Call podcast. Lane Nordland with you here today. We are going to be joined today by Hawaii rancher Kyle Caires, joining us from, he's not in Maui today. I think he's in Kauai. Is that where you're at today, Kyle? Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. But before we jump into the meat of the matter here with Kyle, I do want to just acknowledge all the natural disasters that are occurring across the nation, whether that be the impact of the hurricanes in the southeastern part of the mainland or the catastrophic wildfires impacting producers here in the West, in Wyoming and Montana and everywhere. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association has an online resource called the Disaster Relief Resources page, where you can find more information on hurricane and fire relief in your respective states and how individuals can also support their fellow cattle producers as well. Just visit ncba.org/producers/disaster relief resources. Again, our thoughts and prayers are with everybody being impacted by natural disasters here in the fall of 2024. Well, Kyle, thanks for joining us here today. As I mentioned to our audience, you are a producer there in Hawaii, and your family's been ranching there since the 1940s, I see. And I guess, how are things shaping up here as we move through October here in 2024 for you and your family?
Well, we're praying for rain and we're ready to play in the mud. So we're kind of in that same boat. Everyone wants moisture, and we grow grass, and the cattle convert that into something better. And rain makes the wheels go round. So.
No, very, very true. And, we all pray for rain. We need it. I know here on the mainland, we have gone through several years of drought. I guess from your experience, what has the situation rain-wise been over the past few years compared to everyone here on the mainland?
I'd say like in Hawaii over the last couple decades, drought frequency has greatly increased. And we have a plethora of microclimates across an island. 5 to 10 minutes in a vehicle can take you through like multiple microclimates and soil types. So there's tremendous variation, obviously. But with rainfall and some of the other things, that feast or famine situation is often a reality for cattle producers. A long time ago, the larger ranchers were mainly set up in systems called ahupua'a. So that's basically a land division scheme where a tract of land would be divided from the mountain to the ocean. So with that being said, you have multiple microclimates and seasonal production of grasses. So on the upper slopes, you could have cooler season grasses, and in the lower elevation pastures closer to the ocean, you'd have more of those warm season grasses, warm season annuals. So it would allow for year-round production, so to speak, but it was more of a grazing pattern that was based on seasonal, temporal, and obviously climate. With time and progress, sometimes progress is just change. We've had urbanification and rural expansion. So, some of the larger ranches still benefit from that, but many of the smaller producers have pastures all over in different areas, regions, microclimates. And myself having multiple lease pastures, we end up being a road rancher to a certain extent. So you have to read the play, but you're also playing basketball, baseball, and football all at the same time, depending on what it is you're trying to do. You accomplish spring calving, fall calving, and then if you're selling these critters year round in a grass finish operation, or even if you're feeding cattle, it benefits you to have cattle being produced throughout the year.
No, very, very true. And I think that's a great description. So thanks for giving us that glimpse, because like where I'm out in the Rocky Mountain West, you graze and then winter comes and you feed. And so I think it's so important to share just the complexity of your grazing environments as well, because I think so much of the time people think of Hawaii as beaches and going and seeing that aspect of it, but it truly is way more in depth. And I maybe later in our conversation we can talk about different types of endangered species that you may have on your island. It may be a little different from the grizzly bear that I have in my backyard versus maybe a frog or a plant
Yeah.
that is in your neck of the woods. But let's
Oh,
just talk about Caires Farms
okay.
and the history, and then we'll talk more maybe about those different species. But let's just talk about the history of your family in the livestock arena.
Okay. So, um, my family is obviously from Maui, Hawaii. And my grandfather, he was originally born on the Big Island, and then he moved to Maui in the 40s. Met my grandmother. He was a boiler at the sugar plantation, and he built his homestead. And my mom and her siblings were all heavily involved in 4-H and FFA. They raised animals, and it was sort of a diversified operation, like many families may have had back at the time. They had dairy cows. They raised quite a few hogs. I believe he had 20 to 30 sows. So, multifaceted. The kids were very, very active, and they learned all aspects of production. And through his endeavor with Hawaii Commercial and Sugar Boiler, and some of the other stuff, there were representatives from like the Morinaga Milk Company in Japan. They're still Japan's largest milk producer that would come to my grandfather's micro dairy, and his children would instruct them on why they did what they did with nutrition. And so like my mom and her siblings were plugged into all of that production, nutrition, animal husbandry at a very, very early age. And through like osmosis and sometimes facilitated diffusion, like we learned too, right? The next generation. And I was my grandfather's shadow, so I spent a lot of time with him. And my mom, she had her own venture, Malia Productions, and she was the first asparagus farmer in the state. And she was basically organic in that realm before that was cool. So she had an asparagus farm. So I grew up around cattle and asparagus and a bunch of other young animals, and I was obviously a little bit more interested in the cattle side of things.
What type of cattle was your grandpa raising at the time? And I know you all run a bit of an Angus herd too. I guess what was he running then, and how has it morphed into a focus on Angus?
Well, America was Hereford country, and when America sneezed, Hawaii caught a cold. So Hawaii was also a Hereford country, and over time, he added breeds like Brahman and Angus, and then eventually Brangus. So he had mainly a rainbow or a crossbred herd of cows, but he kept purebred bulls like Angus and um, obviously Brahman to make some of those crosses. The half bloods, whether it be an F1 black baldy female on the Hereford Angus, or an F1 tiger stripe Hereford Brahman. And then that evolved into like those three-way cross cows where you have a super baldy, as they're called now. Just conversion machines, do more with less. Tough as nails, tougher than hammers in some respects. So that Bos Indicus blood, um, a little goes a long way, especially for heat and humidity tolerance on these high lignin tropical forages that may not have that extra kick of nutrition that we'd find in some of the more cool season grasses. And those crossbred cattle were awesome. And again, he maintained purebred bulls that he could rotate. So he sort of had a rototerminal breeding system. He was able to maintain purebreds to replenish replacements, and also make F1 and three-way cross females as well. And those cattle grew like weeds, man. What they didn't have that I really, really recognized and appreciated was the uniformity, so to speak. So they were very profitable. There's no question. In terms of converting, lower quality range into pounds of beef, and it wouldn't matter if you're talking pounds of calf wean per cow exposed or pounds of beef per acre. A little bit of ear does a lot, but on the uniformity side, and when you start undressing these rascals and you pull the hide off, you want to make sure you have a desirable eating experience. And I remember going to the supermarket, and the pork was fairly uniform, the chicken was very uniform, and then being at the beef case at Safeway, I mean, you're like Indiana Jones trying to find the best steak, right? That never sat right with me as a kid. And anyway, so what I noticed through the addition of several Angus bulls, one was a bull that came from Jimmy Stewart's ranch on the Big Island. He had Ho'omau Angus. He had a bull named Mighty Moose, and he was going back to some Jorgensen blood. He was a son of Big Moose out of a cow that was a Emulus Justo. That's some genetics that Tahama Angus Ranch had at the time, and um, some Western Canadian blood from Creston out of California. So just Edrine, Streamline Eston, crossing a Tahama background with that big moose. So we had some of that. I guess you'd call them early growth genetics, and with that came some birth weight, and then you see the next generation of straight bred Angus from that, and the uniformity. There was a sacrifice in terms of weaning weight and pounds on the ground, but pounds pay the bills. Quality pounds pay more bills, and so that uniformity was something that from a really really early age. I remember being like 5 and 6 and talking to my grandfather and picking like the groups of replacements, and there were always some big powerful three-way cross ones, and I really liked them, but those cookie cutter type, I tended to appreciate more, and my interest in the Angus breed grew from there. And I appreciate Brangus and her. Every breed of cattle have great individuals, and you have great individual breeders that help replenish those. But for me, it's always been like the reputation of the breeder is as important as the breed, and the vision of their breeding program, and the integrity behind them, and their practices. That helps basically make everything go forward. So I focused on more of an Angus based cow herd. We've had Brangus and Ultra Blacks, which is basically an Angus bull over the top of a Brangus cow. So instead of like a 5/8 3/8 deal, you're looking at 3/16 or less Brahman blood. So enough ear, but a little ear, but not too much. And we had a lot of those, and we had a dispersal sale in 2013 and 14 where we dispersed most of the cows, and we went down to basically five head. I was in the mainland at the time. I asked my mom, "Hey, just keep these 5 cows." And since coming back, I've kind of rebuilt from the ashes using those few cows as an anchor. So the herd right now is built off of those cows, and fortunately for us, those females that I did pick, there was a lot of longevity built in. So many of those went into their late teens, early 20s, and we had a few that hit the mid 20s as well. And so, while we have younger animals relative to like a herd age standpoint, the scaffolding or the foundation of all of that, there's a tremendous amount of longevity built in our subtropical environment. So while we don't have the percentage of ear that we used to, I have one first generation Brangus cow and one Ultra Black female currently. Maybe we'll expand that a little bit going forward, but we've spent so much time trying to select Angus that have the environmental adaptability, that aren't necessarily just slick haired all year, but are really, really fluid and flexible relative to the environment. Where the weather changes, the hair comes off, they shed off quickly. If we have a monsoon that comes in, or tropical storm season, the hair will come back on even if it's midsummer, and then when it gets hot and humid again, that hair comes back off. So they're really, like, their own biology and whatnot parallels so well with the environment. They have the adaptability and the ability to thermoregulate. So I haven't had the need to up the percentage of ear. And then again, that uniformity, we keep things how we want them. And I guess I focus on, from conception through carcass, we spend a lot of time trying to be balanced, but the quicker we can have that commercially viable slaughter weight from the time of birth is what we try and get out, whether it's a feedlot situation or if it's a grass finishing deal.
So when you were looking at bringing in some new genetics, when you're breeding cattle, do you mainly AI and then have some pasture cleanup bulls too, or are you buying bulls from producers there? Because obviously there's not a lot of Angus breeders on the islands. So when you're looking at some of the genetic selection, I guess what's your process and what is the
Okay.
animal? What's that transportation look like? I guess.
Okay. I guess for me, problem free rings true in terms of the genetic program. I'm not looking for, a 5, 10, 15 year reclamation project. Um, you know, it's tough enough to be profitable in these times of high input costs. So we try and do things to work with Mother Nature and not add extra footsteps to the management process. We do have some cattle in Georgia. We work with Gibson Cattle Company in North Georgia, and we're partners in that. We have Angus and Red Angus there, so that's another source for genetics as well. Um, but in terms of like the AI program, back to your question, I don't AI a whole lot. When we brought genetics into the program, I was very selective in high school. I purchased embryos from a few programs like Van Dyke, Clarence Van Dyke in Montana, and those are some big powerful girls. And while they may have had a lot of size and growth, the input costs on some of those were also a little higher as well. But some really worked, some didn't, just like everything else. So we the foundation of the herd, a lot of genetics I brought in from Van Dykes in Montana. I've used genetics from Tahama Angus Ranch. We acquired some genetics from Olomou Angus and Kipukai Ranch prior to that. We've had other member codes in Angus that we've used before. Depending on age and whatever. When I started Caires Farms, obviously that was a new member code, just to keep everything in separate. But I will AI. But what I typically try and do is I'll bring a new bull, and a new bull. That's a relative term because we utilize some genetics from the 60s and 70s as well. So we have a kind of a mix of classical and contemporary, but I'll try and bring in outside genetics through really, really proven females here that typically carry, a higher percentage of inbreeding. But for the most part, we want those females to be bulletproof with a lot of stayability, a strong track record of performance. They don't need to be outliers in terms of their production. We want the variation to be minimal. And so if we bring in some new blood through something that is time tested, proven in our environment, under our management, under a variety of microclimates. I mean, we've had cattle in pasture that got 180 inches of rain. And then on the other side of the island, we run pastures that, if we're lucky, we get 6 to 8 inches of rain. And when those cattle can go from one place to another without missing a beat, good things tend to happen. A lot of our heifers we develop on a really, really high alkaloid type forage. So they go through their boot camp. And again, if they can thermoregulate it, it's almost like a litmus test for selection pressure for environmental adaptability. If they can deal with that endophyte load, which may eclipse like some of the tall fescue infected Kentucky 31, 130% in terms of like some of the ergot. And
Mhm.
those things are still breeding, cycling and breeding at 14 months, calving between 20 and a half to 23 and a half months, where the cleanup calves are popping up around when those females are 24 months, 24 and a half months. There's a good chance that they're going to stay. And we try and focus on the big picture. So we want the calves destined for market to obviously grow, gain, convert efficiently, and all that. We need them to pay, but the ultimate focus of the program are those practical, problem-free females that stay. So we want the females to stay and play. We want the calves to pay, and so we focus on those traits. A lot of carcass data, actual carcass. We don't have ultrasound here, so we've gotten carcass data for years. I saved up 4-H money and money I earned when I worked in the lab at Oregon State, the embryology lab with Fred Menino. And like one of my first splurge purchases was a Warner Bratzler shear force instrument. So, we got 20, 23, 24 years of Warner Bratzler testing within our herd. And, So a lot of those, we're not getting paid on tenderness, um, but we've had a strong track record where we've done direct beef freezer sales to people and some restaurants over time, and um, I don't get the phone calls about sendbacks, and that means a lot. But we have a steady customer base, and again, with the size of the operation, when we dispersed, a lot of that went away along with the volume of the cow herd. But we're kind of rebuilding now, and again, those older genetics that we incorporate, I've used them before, and I've line bred fiercely to some of them, so I know what they can do. So, in a sense, it's not necessarily let's throw something at the wall and see what sticks. In many cases, like we've had the Candeliers 376, we've had the 259s. Um, you know, we we've used Rito 707. So we've a lot of those cattle we've used here. We've bred intensively to sort of make like substrains within the program. We know what they can do. We know where their limitations are, and um, if there's a problem, we'll get rid of it. There's no second chance here for romance. They don't breed; they're gone. And like you do that for a number of years, um, good things tend to happen, and then you have to decide, oh, what am I going to keep? Now you have to weigh, like right now, high cattle market. It's softened a little bit recently, but um, accelerated like the depreciation on the females. You have to really ask yourself, like, what's worth more to you, retaining a relatively high value replacement heifer and pounding out a cow that's still got many years left. Um, so different problems, but I'd rather focus on that type of thing for decision support than going out there dealing with open cows or sore feet or anything like that. Some traits here, like udders. When I was younger, I thought, oh man, the perfect. We want to try and design this perfect udder, but for a lot of that stuff, convenience traits, you got to have them. It's pass fail. If it's a problem, it's gone, and that served us fairly well. And we've gotten to do some other things, like a lot of the carcass data that we've collected for years. I did subprimal yields on those cattle, and you develop a data set, and I was able to maneuver like an image analysis platform. So we'd break cattle at the 12th and 13th rib, and we'd also break them between the 6th and the 7th. And I used some image analysis in the mid to late 2000s, and that helped us select for decreased seam fat in some of the cattle as well. So again, like it goes back to conversion. Every day on feed, what they're eating and how they're converting that into actual gain is going to like muscle and not so much like trim and external bark, fat cover. We've been using that as a management tool for years, right, to determine cattle that are ready for market. But it's a little bit harder to pinpoint and apply selection pressure for seam fat, right, unless you actually sort of attack it. So we started selecting for cattle that have less seam fat and against some of the cattle that had more seam fat as well. And now we're not necessarily trying to split the atom and look under the microscope so much for the carcass traits. Spend a little bit more time trying to figure out, like, okay, what outside blood am I going to bring into the program, and how am I going to do that? We utilize a lot of our own bulls here. So we'll make our own bulls. We have to be our own seed stock supplier in many cases. We'll market some bulls within the state and outside of the state as well. I did at one time do a lot more work internationally in terms of like exporting, but in recent times it's been more domestic, and that suits us well.
Kyle, it seems to me that did you get a political science degree or an English degree when you went to college?
No.
Oh, I'm joking. What did where did you? I know you mentioned Oregon State, but is that where you got undergrad or
Yeah.
graduate? Where did you go to college at then?
Okay, so I went to Oregon State for my undergraduate program in animal science. Corvallis, Oregon, a great place to live, and man, what a college experience that was. A lot of that department there was, you were not a number. Literally every faculty knew you by name. The staff there, impeccable. Um, I was tremendously blessed to be there at that time in my life with that group of faculty and staff, and I still keep in contact with some of them as well. Great friends along the way. I was on the judging team, and then I went up to Pullman, Washington, at Washington State for my master's and then PhD,
Mhm.
and from there headed east, where I had my first faculty job at Berry College in Rome, Georgia.
I've been to Rome. I've been to all these locations. Pretty good country, but again, a diversification and different climates and different type of cattle that obviously are raised in those areas. And when you look at your time in academics and learning, how have you taken? Obviously, you're so knowledgeable about the genetics you want to focus on and the type of cattle that meet your environment. I guess what how have you taken your education and your time on the mainland working for the universities and researching? How has that translated back to working in Maui or the Hawaiian Islands and helping enhance the cattle industry, not just for yourself but for your peers in the industry as well?
Okay, I said there's a balance. An advisor of mine told me not to let school get in the way of my education early on, and another close friend and still confidant said the same thing to me. So that's kind of been a little bit of a compass that I've used. But Tom Hill at Oregon State, he was an advisor of mine, and he's still involved in the Angus business statewide. But I guess there's between. So we grow up on a ranch, we have that interest, and we go off to school and we want to get back in the industry. I guess there's a couple of things I would say keep in mind. Not everything you learn in the class is going to be applicable, but you better figure out how to apply as much knowledge as you can gain. And the institutional knowledge that your family and your uncles and aunties and friends and other people in the industry may have is tremendously valuable too. It may not come in a classroom, but the school of hard knocks in the real world has probably cashed more checks than anything else. So you need to keep a balance between the textbook and reality. I think that's really that's a key thing for me. Learn as much as you can, and you can learn from everybody. Everyone can teach you something. Like from when we were interested in like selecting for fertility and stability, that wasn't available to us. There were no EPDs then. So I spent a lot of time near the end of my undergraduate and the start of my graduate program just on my own, working through some best linear unbiased prediction and some models and whatnot. And I presented, I think it was a 2006, 2007 Northwest Reproductive Sciences Symposium in Moscow, Idaho, a model and framework for heifer pregnancy and stability in Angus, Brangus, and ultra black females. So we had a model using both like random regression, linear models for genetic prediction of fertility traits that we used in herd. I mean, God, that's almost 20 years ago. So, and while I did BLUP and ran a lot of those types of analyses within our own herd, after you fix a lot of these traits in, you get to a point where you're not always trying to like move the needle, right? Like, hey, we're in a nice little optimum now. Like we have production levels in sync with our management and our environments. So I think when students get into genetics, they're always trying to move the population. Hey, if we select on this side of the curve and we keep selecting here, we're gonna go ahead and move things on down the road in a positive. Well, don't lose yourself in the process. Don't throw the baby out in the bathwater. Yeah. So independent culling levels, there's all kinds of strategies you can do, but select for the things that you're going to get paid on, and try and make sure you don't, wreck the system. So that's in terms of applying big picture stuff with real world. Yeah. Be specific, select for traits, identify the phenotype, try and select and sort on genotypes and go forward. But make sure you know where the rubber meets the road, what you can support, what you can afford to, like how much milk is too much. That's an expensive way to raise a female, especially if you're dealing with, seasonal forage availability, and the forage quality is highly variable, right? So, common sense has got to be married to advancements in technology. Don't just throw tech at it. Don't throw, new technology and computational biology and algorithms at stuff and expect to have a great outcome. Garbage in, garbage out. So big picture stuff Definitely. Going back to you can learn something from everybody. Um, Moving to the southeast was great for me because now we had cattle that were on fescue. So another litmus test for selection is environmental adaptability. It's a slightly different scheme than the grasses we have in Hawaii, but there's a lot of similarities there. And if you can select cattle that are bulletproof on infected Kentucky 31, well, there's no guarantee that they're going to be successful everywhere, but there's probably a higher probability that they're going to be more scheme neutral and environmentally adaptable as you move those suckers across the country. We've sent genetics from us in Hawaii to different parts of the country. We've sent genetics from Georgia to North Dakota, Montana, and the feedback we get from them is, wow, these cattle are just, they're growing, like the birth weights are a lot less than we thought, but they're keeping up with our higher growth bulls. Okay, well, I mean, if you think about it, and the carcass quality is there. That's the thing that we always get feedback. Like, God, these things, it may not show up on ultrasound, at first, but when they actually pull the hide off these things, that's the feedback we typically always get. We sent some bulls into the Oregon, Washington area, and we had a customer with a 63% prime closeout on those cows, and they'd never gotten above 15% prime prior. So if you think about it, they're environmentally adaptable. They're going to be less affected by stress. As a result of their adaptability, they have less environmental stressors. You wouldn't expect anything else but for them to perform better, right? If their health traits are a priority, right? Less intrinsic stress, good things happen, right? Work with Mother Nature. And, there's no EPD for that currently. I mean, you can bits and pieces, but selecting on total profitability is sometimes hard because there's so many traits. But if you avoid extremes and you stay kind of in the middle of the road relative to what your environment and your inputs can support, if you put those cattle in a higher nutrient environment, they'll get to the finish line quicker. And if it behooves you via drought, or if you're doing a grass finish operation and you're going to put them on a lower plane of nutrition, the slow way home, they'll get there too, and they'll be profitable as well. That's what we try and do. So we may not push the envelope in any one trait. So genomics, do we use them? Yes. Do we have EPDs on a lot of the cattle? Yes. Do we use EPDs in terms of heavy selection pressure on our cattle? No. If I'm looking at sires to use, some of those traits may be of particular importance to me, just as independent culling levels, or hey, this is a potential problem area. That's all very helpful, but you take all the data you have, figure out what's most important, prioritize, and not making a decision is also a response. So you have to make a decision and go from there. So some of the genetics that worked really well in Georgia, we've brought back to Hawaii. I'm not doing as much of the stem cell work, obviously, that I was doing previous with my research, but we have a lot of producers here in Hawaii that have started using genomics. And while those predictions are maybe helpful, sometimes they're more helpful within the herd as opposed to figuring out where you rank with everybody else. Because you asked the question, how good is good? Like if you have cattle that are in the 1 percentile for milk, well, unless you have the feed truck and the bunk and the groceries to go down their throat, that's probably not going to pay dividends. So again, finding the levels that are sustainable in your production environment. And that's where the common sense comes in. So I say, like, integrate new technology whenever it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't always pay to be the early adopter, but if you integrate that technology with common sense and you have a plan, very, very rarely, I think, where you get off course.
Yep. So Kyle, it's obviously you talked about the different terrains and the different systems that you have when you're grazing cattle, and just how fast that could change just in elevation. And I think here in the Rocky Mountain West and the Pacific Northwest, where our cows have to travel when they're out on pasture to find feed as well. And we've touched on it obviously, but I guess what advice do you have to producers on the islands or here on the mainland about how important it is to evaluate your climate and also then evaluate your current genetics or possible genetics to bring in to help you succeed, because we all have had cattle that, oh, these cattle got great feet. Well, then you keep them, or you go a little deeper, keeping their heifers, and then they don't have good feet. And you got to hold up in this rocky country too. So whether they're seed stock or commercial, how important is it to evaluate climate and that genetic selection in coming up with that cow that can run in the perfect the environment that you raise cattle in? And like you said, your environment changes just depending on elevation or going right down the road.
Exactly. That's a very good point. So, like for us, it's probably going to be challenging to find a producer who's got cattle in um, really high rainfall swamp areas that also throw them out to the Serengeti. You know, I mean, or if they're not going on a truck from Miles City down to Ocala, Florida, or Okeechobee, and then being taken back 6 months later,
Yeah.
and then somehow being able to breed back, and like that would be helpful maybe to us because somebody else would be breaking those eggs for us. But that's not practical. But I do think one thing that you can do if you're a commercial guy and you're looking to buy bulls, if you can find a seed stock producer that develops those cattle and manages them in a way similar to yourself, you're probably going to have less disappointment than if you're not doing that. So it's more of a probability game, like a likelihood scenario. Like there's no 100% guarantee for success, but if you're getting cattle that are being raised in a similar environment under similar inputs, geology is important too. Like for example, like mineral deficiencies, selenium, copper. I mean, you name it, we got it. We have forages with calcium oxalate levels so high that unless you got a 3.2 to 1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus in your mineral, you're not gonna be very happy with performance. And then, oh my God, there's high molybdenum and low copper, so now you got a double whammy there in terms of that. So we in the tropics have probably a few more gaps, but even geology wise, I mean, you throw some cattle out on like some cool season grass where if you hate it up, you have an RFQ of like 130 to 150. Guinea grass here, mid bloom in good shape, higher bricks, might have an RFQ of 85. We have some producers that would be very upset if their hay dipped below 100 on RFQ, right? So, if a feed truck is going, and I'm not against people feeding cattle, but if you're talking about developing bulls and they're on like a 75, 80,000 mega cow ration, and you're planning to take those bulls out to, Nevada or even parts of the country where you're in that 30 to 50 acre per cow, um, you would you can't help but expect those bulls are going to melt, have a dramatic life changing experience when they get turned out. So if you are sourcing your bulls from someone that is raising them radically different from you and they're maybe overdeveloped, getting them acclimated is probably a good step, just so you can still get cows bred, getting them adjusted, run some young bulls in there. And then, if you're in a lot of stones and these cattle are coming off of irrigated pasture, those bulls aren't going to hold up as well. So, dribbling, there's some strategies, dribbling bulls in after 2 or 3 weeks, pulling the lame ones. There's something you need to get cows bred. You need to get them bred in a timely manner. So management wise, those are some things you can do, but it's probably not going to help your success if you're going, like, for example, if we're in South Texas and we went to Center North Dakota or St. Anthony, North Dakota, or even, upper peninsula, Pennsylvania near the Seep Lakes, or, we bring cattle down to an arid environment, they're probably going to adjust better than if we were taking them to a really hot and humid environment in many cases, but they're still going to suck wind. And some of the cattle in North Dakota, in either of those places, will adjust really, really well. We can go to Ashland, Kansas. We could go to Gardner's and find some cattle that are going to slick off and do very well in an arid environment. And some of them are going to do fine in a humid environment. Some of them may not, right? So, hair shedding. There's I guess the thing is there's so many different variables on the genetic side and the management side, and some of the heritabilities are low and whatnot. You just have to do the best you can to manage what you can manage, control what you can control, and then let your thinking cap and pocketbook help you make those decisions. But it's tough. It's really, really tough. We a few years ago brought in some semen on a bull that came out of basically Nebraska, Colorado, the McConnell program. We've actually done progeny testing for some of the larger bull studs for a number of years. We furnished data from birth through carcass. So we've seen over the last 20 years thousands and thousands of calves from birth all the way through the rail. And we've turned a lot of that data into the breeders and whatnot. And that altitude bull that we use, he was a Gen X bull, Cavanese deal. He worked fairly well in the spots that we used them, and we got along well. We've utilized some genetics recently from Canada as well. Some from the 60s and 70s in Canada, and some more contemporary the last few years. And Harold Reich. So we progeny tested Ripper in Hawaii and Georgia, and some of these cattle shed out really well. I mean, they're coming from cold country. We're talking 6 months out of the year, you're frozen. Those cattle are breaking through ice, trying to get the stockpiled forage underneath. And some of those things will shed off and make Brangus look like they're, falling behind in the lunch line. Like, what you guys are slicker than us right now? And some of them are woolly bullies. And, we're not going to go out and shave. We're not going to go out and shave cows to make them environmentally suited. So, I mean, I don't want to say it's a crapshoot, but you do your homework, you pay attention to the things that matter and what works, and you just try and make the best decisions you can. Use the tools available, but do not let common sense get too far away from what you're doing.
Very true. Now, Kyle, I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes we get focused when we're talking with elected officials on big, scary, endangered animals like a grizzly bear or wolves in certain parts of the lower 48 here. But you also face some challenges on different types of species, plants, frogs, other things like that. What are some of the things that are threatened or endangered that impact cattle grazing there in Maui, where you graze cattle?
There's not too many of them. There's some native insects. There's some native, obviously, I know you call them marine animals. So some pastures have riparian areas and whatnot. But I will say this though, and if I back up for a second, everything seems to be relative, right? So God bless the people in Florida right now, and they're bracing for the storm. But like Henry Kempfer, George Kempfer, Billy Kempfer Cattle Company down there. I sent them a text the other day just to see how everything was going. But when I visited them a few years ago, this was maybe, 10 years ago, we went down there and, we see Brazilian pepper, as they call it. And I'm looking at, oh man, that's Christmas berry. It's the same plant. We pulled up in a field, and it was a test plot that they had going on with University of Florida. It's like Hamarthia, and I look at that's limpo grass. So, sometimes you face similar challenges, and you're dealing with the same thing, but you have different words for it, right? So back to your question in terms of like endangered species and or environmental concerns that may threaten the cattle. When I left Hawaii and I went to Oregon State, the first week I was there, Oregon Cattlemen's Association had a workshop, and it also involved some on-campus meetings at the CH2 Alumni Center, and then we went to the Soap Creek beef herd, and one of the topics was riparian grazing and riparian management. And I remember through the 4 years I was at Oregon State, every time it rained, we had environmentalists that would go down to the streams downstream, like basically downhill of the dairy, and they were collecting water and trying to do coliform testing. And riparian management was a huge thing. You need to fence these areas in the waterways and all that. For me, it was striking because this is a problem. A lot of the ranchers in Hawaii and the soil water conservation districts spent a lot of time, like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with these best practices, and the ranchers were like very progressive and forward thinking and all this. So um, for me, I'm like, wait a minute, like we've had these riparian areas. Like my grandfather, they had swinging gates and established crossing areas and all that stuff back 50, 60 years ago. So it was striking. So a lot of those things that maybe are hitting the radar that are like gaslight type issues in the continental US right now, we haven't had that pressure in terms of like livestock producers, because they put into place mitigation measures over the last few decades. Soil water conservation districts with the rotational grazing and all that, erosion control, building soil health. I mean, most of the ranchers there, they're just it's part of the way that you're wired, and they're not necessarily all involved in NRCS programs. It's just kind of the way of doing business. People are using like adapted forms of like uh, management intensive grazing, some of the savory system, but a lot of those practices are being used, but only recently have more some of the buzzwords hit hit the presses. So a lot of people were doing these things for a long time. Um, the nene goose and reestablishing their habitat, they're not endangered. It was a threatened species. We're part of a program that helped reestablish the nene in two of the areas where we ranch cattle, and those birds are coming back. They're on Maui now, and higher populations than they've been since I was a kid, and on Kauai as well. So most of the ranchers are very environmentally astute. Haleakala Ranch, I'll mention them. They've won environmental stewardship awards. No Bigger Ranch. I mean, these practices are like, they're not getting paid to do it. They're not doing this as like a PR stunt or community relations. They're reestablishing dryland forests. Some of them have replanted native trees, recreating habitat. Um, I would say a major threat to ranching in Hawaii, specifically on Maui, are the feral ungulates, mainly the axis deer. That population has just exploded, especially basically the last 20 years. Like 2003, 2004, it was already a problem, and now we're at a fever pitch, and people are trying to mitigate them. Harvests, trying to get that additional protein into the food chain, but I mean, numbers are so high, and unless you have 6 foot or 8 foot fences, you know, you can't really tend your own pasture reserve. So you may be trying to do all the best practices and rest pastures and all this stuff, but the deer are going ahead and like obliterating your forage supply. And if you're trying to stockpile forage and you're in a particular climatic zone and soil type with a forage species that benefits that seasonal just pounding, the forage goes dormant, so you're not impacting the roots. If the solar panels go like buffalo grass country, the deer are there and they're just eradicating. And so now you have this ridge to reef mentality of decreased soil health and erosion and everything that goes along with it. And now you can't stock as high as you used to with your cattle, even though you got better genetics, you're using the best practices. So the axis deer problem, the proliferation of that particular species, um, has really made ranching on Maui difficult. You have ranchers that are stocking anywhere between 20. So it's axis deer plus increased drought frequency. And now you have less ground cover. There's holes in the mat. Weeds are nature's band-aid. The armor is down. Now you have more weeds, more invasive species. And, it's not a snowball rolling down the hill. It's like, dropping a bomb in a volcano in terms of like environmental impact. And that's very detrimental to ranching as well, especially when the operators are doing everything they can. And when they do put in a fence, and one ranch or one landowner may be able to do that, it's securing their own future in a small sense, but it now shifts that problem and that pressure to the neighbors, right? So there's no silver bullet for that deal. It's going to take an integrated approach from, the community member, because, the deer are also a public health concern, not only in terms of getting on the highway and stuff like that, but it's going to take from the consumer, the public, all the way, through the ranching industry, through conservation, through nonprofits, allied industry groups, the local, regional, and state, and politicians at every level. And We're at a point where, I mean, I worry if, unless there's something put in the farm bill specifically to address that, ranching in Maui County, which includes Molokai, Lanai, Maui, and also Koho'olawe, although uninhabited. Ranching has a rich tradition in those islands over 100 years, and an entire industry, way of life are threatened. We're talking about the largest, land holdings relative to private ownership and the management of those lands. And we all know that unmanaged lands are a bad thing, but it's really difficult to have optimum, range management, land management, environmental stewardship when you have these, spotted rats on the range,
Yeah.
sandblasting the landscape. You don't have food for your cows. And I wanted to mention something earlier too. Like you asked about the drought impacts. We're very fortunate on Maui that we have an operator, George Shishido, and he's a forage producer, and he has a project in Piahi, Maui, and he has a few areas around the island that he does cut grass. And I mean, he's the hardest working man in show business. I mean, James Brown, we'll give him that, but Georgia outworked James Brown, and haying is typically something we think of seasonally. So you have the peak season, you plant, you're harvesting different cuttings, you're servicing equipment in the off season and all that. He's cutting trailers of green shop every day. When he's been able to make silage and baleage, it's been a huge forage resource, especially with the increased drought. And cattlemen have to wean calves, hold them up. Short-term dry lot, the local feedlots on Maui, they depend on him, and he is a full-service shop. I mean, he'll plant, harvest, cut it in the trailer. He delivers it for you, and actually, in the case of different ranches that may have dry lots and pastures, he'll actually put it out there for the cattle as well. And that guy works every day of the year, I think including Christmas. So we're very, very fortunate. The ranching industry is very fortunate to have George Shido on that project, and not the other islands don't have the deer, so they don't necessarily have as much of a demonstrated need for that. But um, we have great practices being utilized by a lot of our operators, and luckily we have someone like George who's out there every day, and even on Christmas, making sure that cattle are fed and feedstocks are being managed the best on the island. So we're very fortunate.
Yep. Practical, common sense solutions to issues, just like we've been talking about here. Well, Kyle, I know you have a busy day there as well, and I know you're trying to get home to Maui as well. But we do appreciate you taking time with us here today. Will you be heading to CattleCon over in San Antonio this year, or not going to be able to make it?
I'll try. I'm planning to attend the Angus convention.
Oh, I'll be there. Yeah,
Sweet, yeah. So we'll hook up there, and
yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited for that opportunity to be around fellow Angus breeders, and just a lot of great people. You look at the delegate lists, even the alternates. I mean, from almost every state, you have like the salt of the earth. Just
Yep.
so I'm really really excited to reconnect with a lot of friends that we have in the Northwest and across the country in the breed, and learn and try and interface with people who are trying to do the same thing.
Yep. Again, Kyle mentioned the American Angus Convention. That's going to be the first few days of November 2024 there in Fort Worth, Texas. And then I mentioned the Cattle Industry Convention, or CattleCon 2025, as I now have to refer to it as CattleCon 25. There we go. And that is February 6th, 4th through the 6th. I am going to redo that because I am talking like I've had a few beers, and I have not. CattleCon 25, that's coming up the 4th through the 6th of February. You can get registered, get your housing taken care of, and head down to San Antonio, Texas for CattleCon as well. A lot of folks, a lot of educational events, Cattlemen's College, and of course you get to meet and talk about issues impacting the industry and working to find solutions, common sense solutions, as Kyle said. But Kyle, I look forward to seeing you there in Fort Worth at Angus Convention. Hopefully maybe we could get a drink and talk a little more there.
Sounds like a plan. And if we can get some 4-H kids together and maybe stitch together, Fort Worth and CattleCon, that would be a really good educational trip. we'll see what we can. They just had a meeting last night, and hopefully it works out.
Yeah. No, that'd be good. And hey, and just a reminder as well, I know they've done it in the past. FFA kids and 4-H kids usually get in free for one of the days of CattleCon. Culver's is usually one of the sponsors of that as well. So just put that on the radar for all the kids in Texas and their surrounding states. If you and your family want to come down for a day, you don't have to register for the whole convention. You can go to the trade show as well and get a day rate. But again, all that information can be found on the ncba.org website. But Kyle, as I said, I appreciate you really sharing a very in-depth knowledge on genetics, on your family operation, and keep going, man. You're moving and shaking there in Maui.
Yeah. What else are we going to do, right? So yeah, we have to keep auguring forward, and we're very. I would say we're very fortunate that the livestock industry, the cattle industry here it's a very well knit community, and people help each other out, and that was one of the nice things about coming back. You see that help at different brandings. People will even fly from one island to another island to come and help. So many hands make for light work, and we're looking forward to our upcoming breeding season for the fall calving.
Well, good luck with that. And again, with our friends as well, good luck with shipping or breeding or calving, whatever season you're in here as you listen to this conversation on the Cattleman's Call podcast. We wish you luck and keep working hard out in the countryside. So, Kyle, thanks for joining us, and thanks to our audience for joining here today. Make sure to click subscribe and share the Cattleman's Call podcast here today. I'm Lane Northland. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with Lane Nordland. For more information, visit ncba.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast today.